Stay or Should I Go was not just a punk anthem of the early 80s. It was also the question plaguing the anti-establishment music. The answer was, of course, to stick around. But if punk was going to survive, it needed to evolve into something more accessible, or in the spirit of the 80s, more commercial. I'm Shannon Doherty, and in this hour, VH1 presents the 80s. We will look at the rise of new wave and the roots of alternative rock.
Punk rock began in the 1970s as a music of youthful working-class rebellion. The music was big in England, but American punk bands never found chart success.
I belong to the blank generation, and I can take it or leave it each time.
By 1980, punk was at a crossroads. Some punk bands went underground. Others changed course and created an eclectic sound called new wave. New wave was easier to listen to than punk, and the rebellion it encouraged was possible even for suburban kids.
Shake it up. Shake it up.
But under the radar, punk was alive and kicking. By the mid-80s, new wave was over, and a fresh punk-driven music surged through small clubs, opening the door for the alternative rock explosion of the early 90s.
Take it, did it.
The punk scene that came out of the late 70s was straightforward, simple songs that were played with a lot of passion and not necessarily with a lot of ability.
Hey, oh, let's go. Hey, oh, let's go. Find it at the backseat.
In the mid-70s, the punk scenes of New York and London reduced rock to its most basic sounds. Fast drums, simple guitar, loud vocals. Punk pierced the tongue of the reigning musical establishment, the expensive concerts and preening rock stars of the 70s.
Compared to sort of like, you know, the Doobie Brothers or the Eagles, it was such a raw sound and it was so uneasy.
I am an anti-Christ. I am an anarchist.
By 1980, punk had failed to catch on with a pop audience, and most of punk's pioneers had burned out or self-destructed.
Trying to forget your generation.
The groups were supposed to destruct, really. That was the very nature of punk.
24 hours before, I want a piece of meat.
I think punk in the late 70s didn't survive through the 80s just because the basic premise of it is not to sell out, you know? And the fact is, when it does become commercial and all the bubblegummers like it, change it because it ain't punk rock.
Even punk's originators found the form restrictive.
I fought the law won.
What you said, the way that you said it, the clothes you wore, the purists were really trying to freeze the music.
The punk ethic became a completely rigid, sterile uniform, everybody looking exactly the same way, all marching to the same beat, tra-la-la-la-la, very dull.
One band was determined not to sound like everyone else and moved beyond the limits of punk.
The band for the 70s into the 80s, to me, the band was really the Clash as far as what came out of punk rock that cracked the mainstream, but for good reason. The Clash took their music and kept changing it and boldly experimented. It's the band U2 wishes they could be.
Formed in England in 1976, the Clash produced socially conscious, sonically abrasive music. In 1980, the band's double album, London Calling, became a surprise commercial success in the U.S.
Thankfully, we had another home in America where people weren't so up themselves about whether it was punk or wasn't it. You know, they could just see, hey, this is a good rock group. So we could kind of escape the very constricting British punk scene, and that freed us up a lot.
London Calling broke the rules of punk by combining elements of reggae, rockabilly, and R&B with punk's passion and speed.
At the time of London Calling, punk, up until then, like punk music was like painting itself into a corner. We attempted to show that we could play any type of music.
With 1982's top 5 hit, Rock the Casbah, The Clash came closer to pop stardom than any punk band at that time.
The Clash cracked that mainstream. They even got into bright clothes, but they still kept some of their punk following. Like you listen to Rock the Casbah, it's not as raw as the first Clash album, but it sure is good.
Still, some of punk's critics viewed The Clash's success as a betrayal.
We couldn't take a lot of that punk stuff too seriously because it got ridiculous. That became a parody of itself. Guys were singing about being so angry and so pissed off and they're earning all this money. And we were like, that's weird for a punk band.
Should I stay or should I come? If you say that you are mine, I'll be here till the day I die.
By the mid-'80s, the band's founding members had split. As the Clash were trying to broaden the horizons of punk, some of the U.S. punk groups were evolving and gaining acceptance.
We went from a real sort of punk, 3-chord wonder kind of, real up-tempo stuff to a different kind of feel. That was part of our success. I mean, basically, if we hadn't experimented and crossed different styles of music, we wouldn't have had Heart of Glass. We wouldn't have had Rapture. I mean, we wouldn't have done some real groundbreaking things.
I think that we were surprised that we got as popular as we did, but when we did, we never wanted that to stop the idea of constant innovation.
You may find yourself living in a shotgun shack.
As bands like Blondie and the Talking Heads made the transition into the 80s, their music got a new name.
How did I get here?
When American radio stations said punk rock, we won't play that, Seymour had a little brainstorm and he said, I'll call it New Wave.
Seymour Stein, the president of Sire Records, had signed several of the New York punk groups in the 70s. In the 80s, he helped usher these bands to the masses.
I felt the punk thing was damaging, and I just felt that there was a whole new wave coming in. It was very left of center at the time, but I've always felt that the best of the esoteric music of one period can very often become the pop music of the next.
The whole idea of the music industry turning a page and actually getting behind these bands, it left the idea of being counterculture and became marketing.
It worked very well, because suddenly, just overnight, we went from being a punk band to being a new wave band. We also got played on the radio after that.
While punk turned off some listeners, it turned on young musicians. Bands of the early 80s gained courage from punk, the confidence to start a band with more attitude than musicianship. As those bands matured, they helped define the 80s sound. When we return,
Punk music rebelled against the establishment. You could hear it in the sound and see it in the defiant look. While young bands of 80s new wave admired punk style, they weren't as interested in the politics.
Oh, you were a punk band?
No way, we're not punk, we're new wave.
I didn't know there was a difference.
Come on, there's a whole different attitude to the music, man. Punkers are into an angry thing. New wave, hey, we're just having fun with it.
in the early 80s, new wave was introduced as a marketing term to distance new bands from 70s punk, which seemed too rough and confrontational for American audiences.
I say whip it. Whip it good.
Eventually, New Wave developed its own identity, and the term was used to distinguish both bands who came out of the punk scene and bands who borrowed elements of punk and made it more accessible.
We just knew that punk rock was going to change the world. You could imagine how disgruntled we all were when New Wave came along. The Knack, that was the first one I remember. The Knack. God, all my punk friends were up in arms.
I think the Knack was cool, but it was, you know, it was definitely not God Save the Queen.
New Wave means it's cat. New Wave means it's pussyfooting. Can't go all the way there, but wants to go halfway there, but hasn't got the guts to go the whole way. So New Wave just made us vomit on the floor.
Unlike punk, New Wave mirrored the affluent 80s, producing music that was flashy, apolitical, and escapist.
I think the New Wave bands probably reached a bigger audience than the punk bands because the message in their music was a lot more pop-oriented. You know, a lot of the punk music was, you know, a lot more political.
Sucker. I know what boys like. I know what guys want. I know what boys like me.
Life has got a few more things to offer than just pure aggression against the status quo. When you really love music, you find a lot of other emotions or modes that you want to express yourself in. So punk becomes a little bit limiting.
Things changed not because people wanted, say, something not as edgy, but the New Wave thing evolved. It was more melodic in a different sense, but it was still edgy.
That was a good time. Yeah. I got pretty good.
I think it comes down to the old questions of like accessibility and melody. New Wave was very, very song-driven, and a lot of the music was really based around these really great hooks.
Made any claim that we didn't love pop music. Our music right from the beginning was always a blend of pop and punk. And we weren't the only ones doing that.
I was trying to take all the anger, all that kind of the hurly-burly nature of punk rock, the kind of, you know, ramble-tamble, the kind of cacophony of noise, and to expand the horizons of the music. I used the springboard of the change between punk rock and the 80s music to do that.
Basically, if you couldn't cut it in punk, you had a good chance of cutting it in New Wave. Adam Ant is a perfect example. Adam Ant started off as a punk. He was a terrible punk rocker. Then he moved on to New Wave, and he did the same thing, the prancing, the mincing, the jumping around, the high-pitched yelps, and it was excellent.
As post-punk bands experimented with musical identities, one band invented a bold signature sound.
When I first heard the Police, I thought this is a band that's going to be around for a while. They just jumped out of the radio.
I'll send that SOS drone. I hope that someone gets my message in the bottle.
In London in the mid-70s, Stuart Copeland, Andy Summers, and Sting formed the Police and started performing in local punk clubs.
The whole scene was very vibrant, but the music kind of left me a little cold. But I just said, this is the way to go. So I thought I can play with that kind of energy, and we'll just hide our ability. We weren't the greatest punk group, and I think the press figured out fairly early that we were imposters.
We
knew too much. Not that you shouldn't know much, but I think it's, when you know a certain amount, it's hard to keep yourself in this narrow straitjacket. But I think then the Police became more new wave, less punk.
By combining musical styles like reggae and jazz with Sting's strong melodies, the Police invented a complex brand of pop.
A lot of people refer to them as the Beatles of the 80s, you know, and I think it's a great point.
With 1983's Synchronicity, the Police had the #1 album and song in America. By now, the biggest act in the world, the Police set out on a stadium tour that left musical categories behind.
They were considered a punk or new wave band at the beginning, and they incorporated reggae into their music, and the way that whole thing evolved was pretty incredible to see it.
At the height of the Police's success, the band split, with Sting moving on to pursue a solo career.
Well, Sting likes to say that it was Shea Stadium, which is where he realized that this is the pinnacle and there's no higher that we can go. We played our best show that night. It all came together that night. I don't think it's possible to achieve more of a nirvana.
Now, there's something rather thrilling about jumping off right at the high point of the curve. And as I look back on it now, I think it was a very, courageous move, which put a great deal of energy into the myth of the band, or the legend of the band.
The post-punk category of new wave freed up bands to try different styles and become better musicians. And as the Police showed, new rules meant that innovative groups could break out of small clubs and move to center stage.